Turning back here to Ottawa, the Prime Minister held his weekly call with premiers last evening, and sources have described that call to CBC News as one of the most tense since they began. The source of the tension? The $14 billion package the federal government is offering provinces and territories to help cover costs associated with reopening the economy. Money that does come with some strings attached. Here's Prime Minister Trudeau on that call.
At our First Minister's meeting yesterday, the Premiers, the Deputy Prime Minister and I continued our discussion on what this plan might look like. We talked about the measures needed, whether that's childcare and paid sick leave, contact tracing and testing, or PPE and support for the most vulnerable. And we talked about the fact that we must keep working together to support Canadians right across the country.
So let's get some perspective from the provinces involved. Dwight is the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. He joins us from St. John's. Hi, Premier Ball. Good to see you again.
It's great to be here, Vashi.
Premier, I wanted to start off and follow up on the conversation that you and your counterparts across the country had with the Prime Minister last night. My colleagues and I have been trying to work as many sources as we can, try to determine what happened during that call. And most of the people we talked to say it was a pretty candid, at times tense call compared to previous ones. And of course, a lot of that has to do with the money the Prime Minister is promising for provinces, $14 billion. What's your take on it?
Well, my take is anytime you get the Prime Minister in a room, you get a group of premiers representing their various provinces, we're always going to be reaching out and asking the federal government for more involvement in the services that we provide to Canadians in the provinces, that we support and that we represent. So there's no question, but the openness, the main thing is, of course, we're having those meetings. We have the Prime Minister and the Deputy Prime Minister at the table. All our premiers are there. So we're still engaged. We're still working together on behalf of all Canadians. We'll continue to make sure that we, put measures in place to protect Canadians, but also the big focus for us on our calls last night, however, was about restarting the economy.
Yeah, and on that restarting the economy, what the federal government has promised is sort of this overall envelope of money, $14 billion, divided among 7 different priorities. And so far from various provinces, we've heard concerns about the strings being attached on one side, but also the amount of money and ask for more money. Where do you sit in that?
Well, of course, we'd like to have flexibility and how the money is spent and it matches up with the priorities in our province. I mean, all of us will have our opinions and our views on what the priorities would be for the people that we represent. So that would give us the flexibility to use the federal support, to support our constituents. So, that's a part of it. And then it's always about the amount of money. We know that from a healthcare perspective, this pandemic has had a tremendous impact on healthcare costs in our provinces. Right now in Newfoundland and Labrador, on an ongoing basis, it's about the federal government supports our healthcare by about 19%. So, for many, many years now, ever since I've been around that table as premiers, we've been always looking to see that level increase. And during this pandemic, we see this as an opportune time to make sure that we get, some extra healthcare funding as well, because we realize that we must prepare for the next wave. And if indeed, those that watch this and monitor this are correct, we're going to need more money, and therefore we need the federal support to step up and help relieve some of the pressure on that system.
My understanding is that the Prime Minister conveyed an openness to that discussion after sort of the acute stuff is dealt with, after the next 6 months is dealt with. Is that accurate from your perspective?
Well, in the 5 years that I've been around, we've already seen one accord where we've seen the federal government step up and provide some support on things like mental health and home support and so on. So this is not an unusual case for the federal government to come and support the provinces, but really it did little into advance on a percentage basis, where we need and where we see healthcare rising in normal times. And during this pandemic times, there's a big focus on that as well. So I think that reflects the conversation. But, this is an opportunity as well that, the money that's being put on the table, is it enough to help us in the future, and we deal with this pandemic in the future. As an idea, as an example, not only are we dealing with the acute care setting, but we're also dealing with mental health costs as well. Some infrastructure that would need to be put in place, proper amounts of PPE so we can appropriately respond. The last thing we want is to see Canadians in a situation where we have to force and close our economy again as we deal with the second wave of this pandemic.
And what is your sense of how reopening is going right now in your province, and where the needs really are? Is it, for example, on PPE? Is it something else? What is your perspective right now?
I think there will always be a need, based on the discussions and the information that we're having, that we're going to need PPE and in amounts, to support the private industry that's opening up and our healthcare supports and so on. So I can't say that I'm comfortable where we are with the level of PPE right now. I'm not. I think we need to have that stockpile. If at all possible, I think we need to be able to produce and manufacture that in Canada. I think there's an opportunity here for Canadian businesses to step up and help support that stockpile by doing the manufacturing right here in our province. So, we're getting ready. We're getting ready as we open up our economy. We've been about 5 or 6 weeks in what has been a very successful reopening campaign. We're currently in alert level 3. We have many of our businesses open right now. We will be in alert level 2, I think, in advance of the time that was outlined in this particular alert, and we could be into alert level 2 in just a couple of weeks. So that would be good news for people in our province. I have to say, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have done a remarkable job in responding to this pandemic, and they've been very compliant with the measures that we put in place, and that helps us open our businesses a little bit sooner.
Premier, on the subject of PPE, what you just said there, I'm wondering where you think those efforts are, at least, or how they have progressed when it comes to the domestic supply chain, because we have heard the federal government make announcements. We've seen a lot of companies step up and retool their operations almost to produce it. But it's difficult, at least from my perspective, to get a gauge of exactly how much is being produced or what timeline. And what can you tell us from what you're seeing with PPE?
Yeah, well, for instance, even in a small province like Newfoundland and Labrador, we've been able to put in place and work with companies for face shields. We're currently working with, companies for gowns and gloves and so on. There's a big focus on us as Atlantic Canadian premiers to be able to do the very same thing. And so we're working and looking at every opportunity that we have within our own province to do so. But we also want to support, companies and industries outside of our province that can actually support a Canadian stockpile. I think this could be critical, as we move forward. But I also realize that there's some great opportunities here for some of the great companies that have been very successful within Canada to step up and manufacture some of that PPE right here in Canada. There'd be nothing more, I think, deserving for Canadian companies to step up and help support and reduce the impact on their own businesses as we go into the second wave.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Premier Ball. Appreciate your time as always.
Appreciate it, Vashi.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is extending the deployment of armed forces in long-term care homes in Ontario and Quebec until June 26th.
Over the past few months, our government has been working with the provinces on providing care for seniors and the most vulnerable. This includes by deploying members of the Canadian Armed Forces to certain long-term care facilities. In Ontario and Quebec, we are extending this deployment to June 26th. Our women and men in uniform are doing a remarkable job. Their help is still needed, so we're making sure that our elders continue to have this vital support.
Now, that is a far cry from what Quebec Premier François Legault had asked for. Premier Legault wants the military in place until mid-September. It's part of his plan to train 10,000 orderlies in the next 3 months to end a critical shortage of workers. The announcement comes on the heels of what was, by many accounts, a pretty testy or candid call between the country's premiers and the Prime Minister last night. Let's bring in the Power Panel to talk about the Federation in this time of COVID-19. Host of the Hurley Burley podcast and partner in the Gandalf Group, David Hurley, joins us. Rubicon Strategies' Corey Tenike, former Director of Communications to Stephen Harper, is with us as well. And over in Montreal, Émilie Nicolas, columnist with Le Devoir. Hi, everybody. Great to see you.
Hello.
Great to be here.
Thanks so much for your patience during the press conference in Alberta. Émilie, let me start with you because a real bone of contention between Quebec and the federal government appears to be the military's deployment in long-term care, how long it will last. The Prime Minister says that they might supplant the military with workers from Canadian Red Cross, but certainly he wasn't saying the military is going to be there until September.
No, he was saying the military might stay there until basically for the next 2 weeks only. I think there's some skepticism of how many people from the Red Cross would be replacing the military. But this is not only the only point of contention happening right now with the provincial government and the federal government with relating to COVID-19. The only The other big file is the issue of regulating asylum seekers who've been working on the front lines of in the long-term home as well. So the provincial government is really not too enthusiastic about giving those people a permanent residency, while the federal government would like to have that file go ahead. So there's on both those issues of the army and as well regulation of the status for asylum seekers who are essential workers. We're seeing a lot of tensions, but there's not a lot of details that are being made public because basically people are, and understandably, trying to talk to and yell at each other, through the media, and so we're seeing definitely some time of tensions. But there's not that much details that's happening in terms of what are the internal conversations that are going on.
And David, I'd add maybe a third bone of contention, and I know it will come as a huge shock to you, but the federal government wants to give provinces money to help with COVID-19. But in this case, they don't want to just write a blank check. They want the money to go to 7 specific areas. I'm told on the call last night that was essentially the source of much of the candid, quote unquote, conversation. I'm guessing that doesn't come as a huge surprise to you.
No, not at all. That's the way the Federation works, is the provincial governments demand money from the federal government for their own areas of jurisdiction, as Mr. Ford is demanding money for long-term care. And the federal government tries to impose on recalcitrant provinces new programs and new ideas using the spending power. I personally am in favor of the spending power. That's how we got Medicare. Maybe this is how we'll get pharmacare.
Corey, what about you? You've been on the inside of the government as those kinds of negotiations occur, obviously not in a pandemic, but otherwise with the provinces. How do you imagine it's going over that, A, the provinces say they need more than $14 billion, but B, that the Prime Minister is really saying, here are the 7 areas this money should go?
Well, I'll try to be even-handed about this. I think there's some good things the federal government has done, and for instance, the work that they've done to assist through the Canadian Armed Forces with long-term care is something that they should get a lot of credit for. However, I think it's not just putting spending restrictions on the money that they've suggested. I think it's that the amount of money is, I think in the opinion of all the premiers, wholly inadequate by probably orders of magnitude. $17 billion is, when compared to the expenditures the federal government's been making in its own areas, versus as well as what the provinces have had to spend, is a very small amount. Given that the federal government really has the big powers to tax and the much larger budget to work with than the provinces, I think provinces were expecting the federal government to be there with a much bigger number, but also with more freedom to choose. But I don't think it's all bad on the federal government either. I think they've done a lot of good things also.
Emily, in Quebec, I know that the strings attached part of it is particularly not well received. Does the Premier have anything to say about the amount of money being proposed?
I think the whole conversation about restarting or relaunching the economy in Quebec has been very heated in the last days. And to be quite honest, this issue of the money coming from the federal government is just one little drop in the whole thing. Basically, for the audience to understand, the Quebec government just put forward this mammoth bill about restarting the economy. And a part of that bill is basically suspending a lot of environmental regulations that we have, for example, to protect land that is endangered or endangered species. There's a lot of things there about suspending our regulation as well about the bids for infrastructure projects. And so there's a lot of things that really created a huge outcry, and so now it's been decided. It just came out today that the bill will not be discussed or adopted until September. So yes, there are the issue of the federal transfer, but the whole idea of how Quebec is going to relaunch its economy and whether or not people are going to make it in a democratic way, it's a very high point of tension right now. And the provincial federal conversation is definitely one part of it, but I'd say that that people have been calling out this proposed bill as something that's very much anti-democratic. People trying to use the emergency measures that are there because it's a public health crisis, and trying to extend them in a very long time. And I know that there have been similar moves as well made in Alberta, for example, to ban protests against pipelines. So this whole question of where is the money being spent and how and what provincial government are entitling themselves to do in order to spend that money, regardless of where it comes from. I think there's a lot of things going on for people who are interested in governance, who are interested in democracy, and are interested in how federalism works. We're very much stuck in a lot of debates right now, but I think that's definitely something to watch, because as often in times of crisis in history, this is when governments trying to do power moves. So it can happen from the federal government, but it can happen from provincial governments as well.
Speaking of how federalism works, David, I was talking to someone in the federal government today who said, yeah, it was testy, but hey, it's about time. It's the only time we've had 13 of these calls. That's more, and he was joking, that's more FMM's, First Minister's meetings than in years, right? I'm wondering if you think that this whole pandemic and the way in which the federal government and provincial governments have had to work together, or not in whatever instance, if you think it will redefine in any way or reshape that relationship going forward, or are we stuck in, the patterns that exist forever?
I think we're stuck in the patterns that exist forever. And I do. I think there's a couple things we need to bear in mind here. One of which is we've all known that all governments were going through a honeymoon period for the last couple of months as everybody rallied around the leadership of the country, tried to support the leadership of the country, and generally felt that our leaders were well motivated, trying to do their best, and everybody rallied around them by and large. But now we're entering into a much more complicated and likely much more divisive period of time, not just in terms of federalism, but in terms of the difficulty of politics. And so all governments are going to be looking for villains other than themselves in this story and looking to offload blame. So that's part of what is happening is political parties who are governments are trying to navigate themselves through what are going to be increasingly choppy territory. The second thing is we shouldn't forget how entrenched the provincial opposition to this federal government was before COVID came along. The Conservative premiers styled themselves as the resistance, and a PQ government in Quebec or a CAQ government in Quebec is not a favorable government to Ottawa. Sorry for misspeaking there. But so these people are angry at this government in the first place and want to be in opposition to this government in the first place. So I think that the combination of the political imperative of finding other villains, combined with the fact that most of the people running governments are ideological opponents of the federal government, don't like the ideas the federal government's bringing to the table about new spending ideas. Mr. Ford, for example, does not like the idea of 10 paid sick days. And so they're resisting these ideas, and they're saying, I've got other priorities. Well, that's always the case, and that will always be the case. And I think that we're probably in for a pretty rocky time in federalism over the next couple of years.
I'm told that that Premier Ford did express that concern over sick days on the call, and that the Prime Minister basically said, and I'm paraphrasing obviously based on what I was told, but that money would be, that the feds would pay for it, and that the money would come out not of the $14 billion. It would be in addition to at least for the next 6 months. That's what they've planned. But you're right. Certainly there are certain ideological differences that present themselves through items that are discussed because of COVID-19. Corey, what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, look, I think there are some ideological differences, but one of the curiosities of the federal Liberal Party and the Liberals in general is they'd be more comfortable with a provincial government or maybe even a municipal government, more akin to want to talk about healthcare and elements of education, the social welfare state, which are provincial jurisdiction, or subways or things like that, which are municipal and provincial, and not as much focus on their own knitting, which is international trade and things that are of national importance and part of where their powers are under the Constitution. I think that one of the things that's being proven out through this crisis, well, I'll say two things. One, that in important moments, to the credit of Canada, our government works pretty well. We saw cities and provinces and the federal government come together in a meaningful way. Not just people coming behind them to try to support their leadership, but you actually saw leaders coming together. I do think we're seeing some of the more normal tensions redevelop. But I think the crisis also showed how much of the decision-making on these sorts of things actually rests with provinces. The federal government couldn't bring in emergency powers and take over the healthcare system, so they have no capacity to do it. These are provincially run. A lot of the work that had to be done to fight the pandemic was provincial by nature, and I think it really highlighted the importance of provincial government when it comes to a lot of things that touch people's lives.
Well, we have a premier coming up, so that leads me very much into that discussion. Thank you very much to all three of you. Thanks to our power panel tonight. Really appreciate it. Have a great weekend, guys.
Great. Take care.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
David Hurley, Emily Nicola, and Corey Tenike. As I mentioned, we were talking with the power panel about the discussion last night between premiers across the country and the Prime Minister. We'll get some more perspective from one of the provinces involved in that call. Sandy Silver is the Premier of Yukon, and he joins us from Whitehorse. Hi, Premier Silver. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well, Vashi.
Thanks very much for making time for our program. I wanted to start off and ask you about the call, the now weekly call that premiers have with the Prime Minister. It took place last night. My understanding, based on some people in both provincial and the federal governments that I've spoken with, or who I've spoken with, that it was a bit more contentious than usual, probably because of what I'm told is around that amount of money, the $14 billion from the federal government, and some of the concerns premiers have about the way in which that money might be utilized. Tell me from your perspective, is it enough money the federal government is offering, and do you have any concerns about the strings attached?
We're very thankful for the programming and funds that have been allocated from the federal government to date. I think it was a tough conversation for sure, but what I heard right across from coast to coast to coast was Premier saying very thankful for the supports, the federal supports so far. Now it's a matter of diving into the details, the adequacy of the funding, the scope of the funding, how flexible the funding is. There's jurisdictions in the Maritimes and Manitoba and across the north where we have 14-day border provisions, not necessarily seeing funding allocated for those specific regional supports. So I think the devil's in the details of what happens after $14 billion once this is spent and allocated. What other foot is going to drop. But we're always concerned about per capita spending as well. We think that the North being in a unique situation, we want to be considered with the base plus model. But I think that those details are going to be worked out, and hopefully we'll get the flexibility that we're looking for.
When it comes to the concept, I guess, about where the money is directed, the whole idea of a safe restart, where are your most acute needs?
Our most vulnerable people, for sure, is a consideration always. Again, the expense of having folks at the border, both welcoming folks into the Yukon for essential critical services, but as we prepare to head into phase 2 of our reopening plan and bubbling with our amazing neighbors in British Columbia, welcoming them, but also the narrative of what is expected of people as they travel into the Yukon. That's a massive expense right now at our border. Also, our tourism industry. I heard Dennis, Premier King, was on your show yesterday talking about the exact same thing. Right across the country, our tourism industry operators are struggling and need to see support now more than ever. So those are extremely important and topical conversations that we brought forth to the conversation yesterday, and we'll continue to do so.
In that conversation with Premier King, I asked him about whether or not he'd received any assurances from the federal government that there would be something above and beyond for the tourism sector, what has already been offered as far as financial aid for all sorts of different industries goes. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, have you received any assurances that there might be something more for the tourism industry?
Good question, Vashi. I mean, it comes down to looking historically as we go through the last few months of dealing with the pandemic. A lot of regions will get out in front and say, look, we need to put money towards certain sectors. One of the first things we did here in Yukon was to cancel the Arctic Winter Games, which was devastating. It really was. But at that time, as a government, we put millions of dollars into relief for those people that that would be part of tourism, but also engagement in sports and recreation and community awareness. We put money, our own territorial dollars, into those relief packages. And as we do those individual actions and regional actions, we have been seeing a responsive government that in certain areas have even coordinated with us. We've seen a great coordination on our, we have $30,000 in fixed costs to business relief. that we put out, and CanNor, which is a federal agency here in Yukon, matched that funding to extend that program. Our sick leave provision in Yukon is what's being discussed right across the nation, as the federal government has a model for the rest of Canada. So we're seeing a very responsive government to regional efforts, and that's, again, by having those weekly conversations at the Council of the Federation, First Ministers meetings. I'm also the Minister of Finance, to have those weekly meetings as well. We're getting the message out. We're seeing a responsive federal government when it came to starting with the pandemic and dealing with the pandemic. Hopefully we'll see that continue as we work with reopening plans in the federal government. We
learned a few days ago, Premier, that likely the restrictions at the border will continue into the summer. What are your thoughts and concerns around the border, and would you like to see those restrictions relaxed, or where do you sit on that?
Again, another good question. I have concerns with my partners and friends at the Council of the Federation. John Horgan, Premier Horgan, has a whole other situation than what we have here. We know that the 14 or so states in the United States right now are back at the numbers right at the beginning of COVID, so I understand those concerns. My message to the table yesterday was we have to move forward with mobility considerations, not based upon geography, but based upon epidemiology. So if we're opening our borders to British Columbia because they've done such a fantastic job of planking the curve, and we've done the same here, and we can move forward there, we should be able to consider jurisdictions inside of Canada with the same type of epidemiology. My question to my peers and to the Deputy Prime Minister and Prime Minister of Canada, would we then apply that to the states? Would we apply that to international? How are we going to have a united approach when it comes to dealing with our border issues based upon epidemiology? And it's a good conversation. There's not a lot of unity necessarily across Canada on the issue, but for really good reasons. We're all in different situations. The realities in Quebec right now, looking across the border to the New England area, New York, that type of thing, is different than Alberta looking across the borders there, and definitely different than British Columbia or us looking at Alaska. But again, if we follow the science, I think we'll follow the best pathway forward.
I do want to switch topics before I let you go, Premier, and ask you about a big conversation in this country this week around racism, and in particular racism and the intersection of it with policing, especially, lots of concentration on the RCMP's behavior in certain instances in the north. Do you think there is a problem with systemic racism in the RCMP?
I think there's systemic racism in every corner of our beautiful country. And I sat down with the top cop, the Chief Superintendent, Scott Shepherd, yesterday, and we had exactly this conversation. What's really important is, as we look at funding models, as we look at supports for policing, we need to look at supports for community engagement. Chief Doris Bill of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation is also being very vocal on this concept as well. We need to make sure that RCMP, the First Nations communities have done such a good job of making inroads with the RCMP here in the Yukon. I hold up the leadership, Chief Kane as well here in Whitehorse at the On Council, right through to all of our chiefs throughout the Yukon and our municipal leaders as well. We have excellent rapport with the RCMP. We see RCMP officers in Old Crow delivering groceries to elders during COVID times. We need to put money and continue to put money into community supports. We have these amazing auxiliary programs, community safety programs that are in partnership with First Nations governments that assist the RCMP when it comes to social issues with when dealing with our most marginalized citizens. As we have a national conversation about cameras, we need to have a national conversation about making sure that any federal supports that come down the pipe into these communities, has the direction and the lead from the communities, because the chiefs and the mayors, the community leaders know what's best to do as far as community support, mental wellness supports. And I really want the conversation to pivot towards mental wellness, preparedness for our officers to be excellent reflections of the communities in which they serve.
Could that mean a reduction in sort of classical or traditional funding for police directed to those items that you mentioned? Because that is also a part of the bigger conversation elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a good question. Shifting, definitely. And, these body cameras, they're $1,000 a pop, let alone the technologies and the FTEs, the people to implement the technologies. That's a lot of money across Canada. Let's make sure that we do our research about jurisdictions like Calgary, for example, and others that have the cameras right now. Let's see if they work. Let's see if they accomplish the goal. Let's also make sure that if any money goes towards more assets that are on the vests of the RCMP officers, again, the bigger conversation here, if we really want to deal with systemic racism, if we want to deal with making sure that our communities are safe, we need to pivot this conversation to mental wellness, training in mental wellness, the ability for the RCMP to interact with, in Yukon, we have some amazing forward progressive legislation on justice agreements with our First Nations governments, which gives the control of justice into their hands. And we're very, very proud of that. We want to keep the conversation going, follow the lead of the First Nations governments when they say things like we need to make sure that the money that goes into RCMP doesn't get reduced, it gets shifted to make sure that we address the concerns of the Indigenous population, of our anything that's being discriminatory in all of our regions, but also let's boost some funding to community organizations that promote and facilitate wellness and community safety.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Premier. Great to have you on the program.
Thanks for the time today, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.